When making fashion notes and to quickly design fashion for worlds and characters, as well as to do studies of various fashion, I use a model and either traditionally trace over with paper or digitally on a layer over top. First, you need to remember that when you're making these fashion models, you're making them primarily to showcase the clothing, either studies or designs you're making yourself, and therefore the poses should be able to show the clothing well. If you make a more boring pose, with the arms out and the legs apart, this may actually be better for showing the clothing, but you don't want all your fashion models to be in the same boring pose. It's often a good idea to make a couple in a more boring standard pose, and then make the other ones a little bit more interesting. If you put the fingers on the hips and in the picture, then you need to remember that you're going to have to make the fabric bend and fold around that. For this third model, I kept that in mind. For the fourth model, I wanted a side view of the head, as well as one of the arms sticking out and one overlaid behind. These are the 4 example models. I was feeling really sick when I started doing this, and I was having a bad art day in general, and that's why the models are so wonky and off. I'm going to bring in the reference I used later, after making it a little more modest in a separate file, so that I can show you how I made sure these models were more accurate. Here I'm coming back actually the next day when I'm not feeling anywhere near as sick and having a much better art day to try to make corrections and get things more accurate. When working traditionally, you'll have to erase and possibly use rulers to help check lineups and things on the reference. You can even scale up and down mathematically using that method. Digitally, you can even put your reference right next to it if you're copying a reference a little more directly. But as you can see, I actually changed the pose slightly from the reference here, so it's slightly from the side. And none of these are absolutely identical with the reference. I also changed the ethnicity of the various models so they weren't all the same. Unless your goal is to copy a reference exactly, it's fairly simple to actually change things up a bit, especially if you're doing so intentionally. I actually had to fix this male model quite a bit until I was happy with it, but in the end, I actually was fairly happy with it. On a separate layer digitally, I created red lines going straight across in order to make different lineups with parts of the body, trying to get the proportions and size of things more accurate to the model. Obviously, I didn't quite capture the bend in the spine from the model, even though that probably would have been a more interesting pose. I'm still happy with it, considering the purpose of the model is actually to be used to draw clothing. But I'm probably going to do more fashion models later and try to continue to improve in my art. If you have a character design you made that you really love, that you think is beautiful, who's more of a fashionista and likes lots of different clothing, and you want to do lots of clothing designs for them, I advise doing specific fashion models for that character. I also advise making them more bold and more nude, completely nude or with pasties like these, so that you can do different hairstyles for that character every time you do different clothing designs as well. I also consider doing a side view, which I didn't in this video, but doing a side view or a rear view is also very helpful, especially if the clothing designs involve differences in the side stitching or the backs of the clothing. I'll be sure to do side and rear view models for future videos relating to fashion and clothing design. I also advise looking at reference of people of the different ethnicities you're trying to make this character or model based on, and look at the way the skin tone actually looks and the colors actually look. Sometimes you can do things completely from your memory because you've seen a lot of things in your life, but other times it's better to actually look at reference. Digitally, you can also steal colors directly from photographs and make color palettes and use those actual colors to paint in things as accurately as possible color-wise. Here, I actually guess the colors rather than color paletting. As you can see, on a layer above, I'm starting to do the actual clothing designs. Because I have such a full model rendered in, I can go right in with inking and actually draw the clothing in. I'm using reference off screen to draw these different designs. Some elements I'm changing, some elements I'm keeping identical to the reference, and some elements I'm taking out because the focus is actually on the jackets, not the whole outfit. For jackets that are not for winter, it's important to remember that they don't need to be as heavy, although jackets for early spring and late fall are more similar to, or actually are, winter jackets. These jackets here tend to be more on the thinner side. There's also lots of different jackets. As you can see from these designs, I worked on trying to show a good variety of jackets rather than too many that are the same. The length of the jacket makes a big difference, as well as how tight or tailor-fitted it is to the body. The material a jacket is made out of can best be expressed in line art by how thick you make the lines, as well as by how flowy they are. The type of material used and the way it sits on the body will affect the way it wrinkles. At bends and joints, there will be often more wrinkles. Where there will be no wrinkles tends to be along the surface where a fabric rests, but the thickness of the fabric, the way the fabric fits the body, will affect these wrinkles. So the three-dimensional form of the body underneath is what the fabric is resting on and curving around. Designing any sort of clothing or costume, make sure it suits the character's personality, the materials and styles affordable to the character, the temperature and time of year, the event or reason the character is wearing it, the materials it's made of, how it is taken off and put on the body, and any other reasons you can think of. Always consider the character first if designing a new outfit. When you're making several designs in a row, try to get variety, but that still suits the character. When working in line art, the thickness of the line can express several things. The style you're working in will affect this. If you're using a thin line style that doesn't have much line or any line variation, then disregard the following. If you're using various line thicknesses, I advise using a thicker line to express jackets, because they're almost always made of a thicker material than the average clothing. Jackets are made for warmth. Even a thin jacket is often thicker than the average shirt. Remember that references can also include things directly from life. If you have similar clothing, you can take photo reference of yourself in it, or even draw your friends wearing their clothing. Taking out the actual jacket you own and using it as a visual reference when painting it can actually be extremely helpful, especially if you can get the lighting similar. You can look at the way the fabric looks. Based on the type of art you're doing, how large or detailed it is, or the materials you're using to create the art, is how detailed you want to get. Digitally, it's easier to add textures and tone to make the fabric really look like specific fabric. Whereas if you're working in pure line art or grayscale, you might not want to go into so much detail. But looking at the actual fabric in real life is still extremely helpful and should be an option you remember. Remember, fabric can have patterns on it. Here I added a repeating flower pattern to this jacket. Remember to make your design as detailed or simplified as you need for the purposes of the design. If you're designing something for animation or for graphic novel use, consider how difficult it would be to redraw that level of detail before committing to a design that would be difficult to reproduce over and over again. However, if you're doing one detailed design or a character you're only going to paint long form a few times, making a very intricate detailed design might be a beautiful option, and you might prefer the artwork that way. The way you want your art to look should be the way you want it to look, so make sure the design suits the character and purpose for the art. Adding in highlights will really show how shiny or dull a surface is, so make sure to try to get the highlighting correct. The mid and dark tone is also very important, but I find to make a fabric look more the way you want, it's actually the highlights that seem to make the biggest difference. You can leave your comments below if you have suggestions for future videos, and let me know if you want more in fashion, character, and costume design specifically as well. I hope that this video was enjoyable and it was actually useful for people. I hope that people can make their own fashion designs and studies. I do advise creating the fashion models yourself in order to trace and draw over to make your own designs. It saves a lot of time. Goodbye!